Known for his raid on Harper's Ferry, John Brown was an aggressive abolitionist whose legacy left a lasting fire in the American people. This fire would lead into the bloodiest conflict on our country's soil and grip people for generations to come. John Brown was the eldest born in Torrington, Connecticut on May 9, 1800, to poor but respectable parents in the Puritan faith. Early in his youth, his family would move around before settling in Hudson, Ohio. This town was one of the heights of the abolitionist sentiments in the country, being a stop of the Underground Railroad. With the seeds of abolition laid in him by his loved ones and his community, at the age of 12, he bore witness to the beating of a young slave. This was the moment John Brown swore to raise the slave's condition. Spending time studying the Bible and working and running a tannery, he fathered 7 of 20 children with his first wife. With a move to Pennsylvania, he ran a stop on the Underground Railroad, befriending Native Americans in the meantime while trying to make ends meet for his large family. He even was the postmaster of his town for 7 years. In 1829, he refused to help drive out Native Americans from local lands, stating,
"I will have nothing to do with so mean an act. I would sooner take my gun and help drive you out of the country."
Brown instead talked to them and welcomed them to his home and supplied them with food. Later, in Kansas, Brown would befriend many natives and would even be invited to meet the chief of the local natives, who appointed Brown as the surveyor of their lands to protect them, remarking,
"While we were in Kansas, I did not know or hear of a single act of unkindness by any of these Indians to the white settlers."
John Brown, a longtime evangelical Christian, had a dream, a prophecy, where he saw himself as an instrument of God to break the shackles and bonds of slavery in America. When news broke of the battle for the state of Kansas between pro- and anti-slavery forces, John Brown raced to Kansas with a cargo of weapons and ammunition to fight for the abolitionist side. In the spring of 1856, pro-slavery forces, led by the sheriff of the slave city of Lecompton, ransacked the free city of Lawrence. This act destroyed local newspapers and buildings, with 1 death. The next day, news reached Brown of the caning of anti-slavery Senator Charles Sumner in the federal Senate. Frustrated by the violence of the pro-slavery forces and the lack of action by the abolitionists, Brown decided he needed to take matters into his own hands. The Pottawatomie Massacre occurred the night of May 24th into the next morning. John and his men took to the residence of slave hunters and pro-slavery militants and slaughtered them north of Pottawatomie Creek. This action would lead to the worst and bloodiest 3 months of bleeding Kansas. This was total to the death of 29 people in the name of the fight to preserve and/or expel slavery, including Brown's own son, a foreshadow of things to come. While Brown lived in the free slave town of Timbuktu, New York, he began floating the idea of striking critical infrastructure to the slave systems in the country. He began fundraising for his plan, eventually landing on 6 patrons and donations of a half-dozen or so others. He arrived at Harper's Ferry on July 3, 1859. His expected recruits did not show up in the numbers he had anticipated. He went through with his plans on October 16, 1859, venturing on with 18 men, leaving 3 behind to stay guard in the rear. With the raid going well initially after cutting communications out of the town, their fall came with a passing train who called for help in a telegram the next town over. The town was then pinned by the local militia who wounded Brown's son, Watson and Oliver, who succumbed to their wounds minutes later. The U.S. Marines surrounded their improvised fort in the morning of October 18th. They offered them to surrender, and their lives would be spared. Brown refused, and then the men were all taken captive. In the raid, 4 were killed and 9 wounded in the town, but of Brown's men, 10 were killed. Brown's son Owen and 4 others escaped, and 7, including Brown, were captured. The trial for his crimes in the raid began on October 27th, and John Brown expressed no regret or remorse, for he believed he had done the will of God. This trial and his letters after his conviction only ever did him good in the eyes of the North. It became clear he would die a beloved martyr. To this effect, he claimed,
"My blood will do vastly more towards advancing the cause I have earnestly endeavored to promote than all I have done in my life before. I am worth inconceivably more to hang than for any other purpose.
Brown's last words were as such.
I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. I had, as I now think, vainly flattered myself that without very much bloodshed it might be done. For as long as these sins plague the hearts of men, I may never truly die.
With Brown hanged, his body was sent to his homestead to be buried in peace with his family. To maintain order, a duplicate casket was sent onwards to lead the angry crowd away so the true casket could make its way in peace. The North tolled their bells, the South revealed in joy. Of Brown, his contemporaries spoke of him as he was a saint in the cause of man. Harriet Tubman thought of Brown to be the greatest white man who ever lived, as said by Kate Clifford Larson. His close friend, Frederick Douglass, said of him, "Patrick Henry loved liberty for the rich and the great. John Brown loved liberty for the poor and the weak." When the states went to war with each other, Brown's prophecy of last words came true. Union soldiers would report seeing him in the flames around them, cheering them on and fighting alongside them. It is unknown if this is just war fever, stories of high morale, or something more supernatural.